What's the next month going to look like here in Hong Kong and its relationship with China?
Well, China's position is clear. It does not want another Tiananmen Square. Given the confrontation it has with the United States, it wants international support, and a bloodbath in Hong Kong would cost it that. It can't afford it. Its assumption is that in due course, the demonstrators will get tired. There's one interesting thing about demonstrations. You can be on the streets only so long before it gets tedious and you're not getting anywhere. And they're hoping that that point will come. The question is, will the demonstrators try to provoke Beijing into taking some sort of action? So far they haven't, so we're in a standoff.
Do you think we get to that point? I mean, people talk about the 70th anniversary, which is in 4 weeks' time, as your quote-unquote soft deadline. It doesn't seem they're any closer to any resolution here. What do you think happens then?
Well, you know, the funny thing about something like these demonstrations, they get normalized. The world stops being interested. Hong Kong has people in the streets. Their parents come and take them home, or what have you. The normalization of demonstration costs it the point. And if it loses a point, people will drift away. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen in Hong Kong, although I suspect it might, but that's what Beijing is banking on. It's also very important to bear in mind that there must be some very interesting debates going on in the Central Committee of what path to take. It's very hard to believe in this situation that there's unanimity or that everybody really supports the decisions that are being made. They have a complex political system, and one of the things to really watch is the emergence of any tension in Beijing over this or other issues.
It's interesting, Carrie Lam, in that Reuters tape that they obtained, how she was essentially saying that any decision in Hong Kong was above her pay grade, i.e. China would make it, and China is not willing to make any concessions. Is there a point at which they might, in your view?
Well, again, take a look at their international position. The really important questions are their trade war with the United States, trying to build coalitions that support them, getting the Europeans somehow in line, not joining the Americans. These are all vital. They can't afford the kind of backlash that would occur politically in many of these countries if they went in violently, and that's why they haven't done that. So the Chinese can absorb unrest in Hong Kong right now a lot better than they can absorb the consequences of an intervention.
You're saying it's now important to look at the Chinese leader and the sort of pressures he's probably on. And let's also include here what's going on with the trade war as well. I mean, is that incentivizing the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, to look strong?
Well, it's not a question of looking strong. They're being hurt by this trade war. They export 4% of their GDP to the United States. The United States exports less than 1/2 of its GDP to China. It's an asymmetric conflict. The United States can withstand it, although the media will find all the places where it's hurting. The United States can withstand that a lot more than the Chinese can. On the other hand, China has a problem. It is dependent on exports, and it's also dependent on protecting its economy. It can't simply accept the kind of demands that are being made. Demands, by the way, that go back to the Obama administration. So the problem they have here is they can't concede, and they sort of have to stand there and take it for as long as possible, which is why everything else they're doing is kind of secondary.
Many people would disagree with you, George, when you said that the U.S. is better equipped or in better shape than the Chinese economy or the Chinese policymakers to deal with sort of their own domestic economies. What makes you say that?
Simply the amount we derive from our trade exports to China and the amount that the Chinese derive from the United States. The second point is that China is a heavy exporter. 15%, 18% of its GDP comes from exports. The United States is a minimal exporter, about 12%, over half of that coming from Mexico and Canada, from North America. We are not that dependent. Now, it's a political season, so obviously everybody is going to blame the administration for getting into trouble and maximizing it. But the math is very clear. The U.S. is not dependent on exports for its economy nearly as much as the Chinese. and most of our exports are local.
But is it about that, or is it about, as the Chinese would suggest in the editorials of state-run newspapers, that is about keeping China down, and ultimately that could be perhaps backed up by some of the people who are advising Donald Trump?
Well, you know, China has had a wonderful run, and it's now Japan in 1988, 89. Its financial system is in shambles. It can no longer compete with many other countries exporting. Many of the promises that it made internally to its public have to be limited. And so China has to reshape itself. But Japan was in a better position. It did not have a large pool of impoverished people as the interior of China has. And Beijing is balancing many different things. It is not necessary for the United States to bring pressure on China to limit it. China has an internal problem, as any country that develops as a major exporter has, when they no longer have the wage advantage. They've lost the wage advantage. Vietnam, Colombia, other places are taking away markets from them. They're trying to go into high tech, which means they're competing with the United States, with South Korea, with Japan, Germany. That's tough tickets. And you are in a situation where the Chinese have cyclically entered a problem, and the United States has no intention of making it easier for them. So that much of it is true.
George, okay, so if we get a deal here, could we, you know, you brought up the comparison with Japan, and could you equate that with the Plaza Accords that the Japanese had to accede to as well and devalue the yen at that stage? I'm not saying it's like for like, but in a similar sort of way, it could change the trajectory of China in the future.
It's a little more difficult in China. The United States wants access to the Chinese market on the same terms it provides access to the American market. The Chinese are also trying to stimulate domestic consumption to support domestic production because it's lost many markets. So what the United States is asking for, the Japanese could give. They had more room for maneuver, they had more wealth. The Chinese can't give the same thing. So the situation is the U.S. could hold this position for a very long time. The Chinese need to make some concessions that they can't afford to. We're sort of in a deadlock, but the Chinese are the weak hand.
Right. In your view, George, final question. I mean, yes, the economy was dependent on exports. I need to emphasize that more so in the last 10 years than it is now. It's a 60% domestic consumption-led economy. But that being said, a lot of the jobs, you're correct, are still dependent on export types of jobs, supply chains, what have you. What do you think the Chinese can give to perhaps strike an interim deal? And do you think do you think they know what they need to give?
Yeah, I think they know what they need to give, but it's the same situation that the Obama administration had. Remember, the Obama administration sent negotiators to China asking for access, asking for not manipulating the yuan. They asked for all these things. The difference here is that where they asked, were rebuffed and went away, Trump countered. And the fact that he's countered makes it a different game. And this is why I've asked the question, what's going on in the Central Committee? Xi has failed to manage the United States, which is the job of the president of China. He has an unrest in Hong Kong. The South China Sea, it's made no progress. So the question that I ask, and I really have no idea, is with all the problems that don't have clear solutions, Hong Kong, the trade issue, what's going on in the Central Committee? Love to know.